Okay, we're really live.
Yeah.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. This is Ian Trevethan. I am the Education and Outreach Director here at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History, and I am here with Dr. Laura Wilson, who is, among other things, our Chief Curator here at the Sternberg Museum. And we are continuing our talk about, I guess, leading into the Arctic. We had such a good time last time, just sort of talking about what you do that we didn't quite get to the meat of the stuff you were doing in the Arctic. So you want to set that up for us?
Sure. Well, I had a great time talking to everybody last week. It was my first time on one of these Facebook Lives, so I kind of got a little rush. I haven't been in a classroom in a couple of months or given a presentation in a while. So it was a lot of fun, and to get to share the type of research that my students and I do and the questions that I'm interested in and how it ties into the collections and some of the research and education goals of the Sternberg Museum. So I kind of approached Ian about even joining a Facebook Live, not about what we talked about last week, but about what I wanted to talk about this week. When we got into the Arctic exhibit, I was here when we're unpacking the truck and opening the crates, and it was really exciting because seeing these pictures, these great works of art, just really brought back all of these memories, because I was fortunate enough in 2007 to go to the Arctic. I went to the Canadian Arctic to do some field research, so to look for fossils. I was on an all-Canadian crew with faculty and students from McGill University and also the Canadian Museum of Nature. And so it was a fantastic opportunity. And it was just crazy because looking at these paintings, that's exactly what it looks like up there. You kind of look at them and you're like, oh, they're just kind of gray and white and maybe some blues and a little bit of green. And that's really what it is. So I kind of wanted to do a little presentation or just talk about and show some of the photographs that I had up there. So if you've been into the museum and seen the exhibit, or if you want to come in the museum and see the exhibit, a little bit of comparison and how realistic this artwork is. And then kind of talk about why I was there. And so some of the setup that we talked about last week is kind of what my research is and how that will tie into why I was in the Arctic in the first place.
So yeah, the lighting there would be interesting because you were there during the summer, right? So
I was up there actually this time 13 years ago. So we got up there, I want to say like the 30th of June, and then we're up there until the third week or fourth week of July. So we're up there about 3 to 4 weeks. And yeah, so yeah, it's 24-hour sun, and it's ridiculous. I think about packing. We had packing lists, and I bought, because I didn't have one, and then packed a face mask because we're sleeping in tents, but then the sun doesn't set. So if you're really sensitive to light, it'll really throw off your sleep patterns, because there's always sun streaming in your tent when you're trying to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I bought a face mask, and then I remember getting up there and I was like, oh, I'm so excited to see the Northern Lights. They're going to be great. And then I just kind of like smacked myself, face palms. It's like, oh yeah, the sun's not going to set, which is why I brought the face mask. So it is definitely surreal, and really, really unique. I mean, who live there is not unique, but it was very unique to me, from somebody from the southern U.S., so much further south. And we were up there doing field work, but we still did a lot of, a little bit, I'd say, not a lot of interacting with locals. We kind of went in and out of a little hamlet of about 1,700 called Pond Inlet. And so, going to the little grocery store, convenience store, there's a little restaurant, talking to local kids, meeting people who had never seen a tree before, was really unique. I was there with a bunch of Southern Canadians, so from Ottawa or from Montreal and things like that, places like that. And so they were Southerners. And then all of a sudden I was there, and I'm originally from Georgia. And so I was really, really Southern. And it just kind of it kind of threw them a loop, and then it threw me a loop to hear Canadians called Southern. So it was a lot of fun and just really, really special experience.
Very, very cool. Yeah, it's a hard thing to describe to people. I was an exchange student many years ago when I was in high school, and one of the first places I arrived was Helsinki, Finland, about the same time of the year. So not as far north quite as you were, but you still experience, they called it white nights, and you get there, you're all jet lagged, and then the sun doesn't go down. And so
yeah,
that's what I struggled with, is I just didn't want to sleep, and eventually it catches up with you. So
well, I was lucky. I only went a couple of times because I was living in Colorado at the time during my PhD, and so I just had to go a couple of time zones east. So I was on East Coast time, so I didn't really have to deal with the jet lag, which was really nice. I mean, that's one of the nice things about changing latitude and not longitude.
So a little bit different, but
yeah,
it's one of those things that I struggle to describe to people when I got back home. And I'm from the northern U.S., so same thing.
Yep.
All right, so where do you want to lead into here?
So I did put together, so one of the reasons why we're doing the kind of Facebook Live via Zoom is A, we can social distance and we can both talk without masks on. But B, I did want to share just some of the photos. So I have a little slideshow set up. So we can jump straight into that if you're cool.
I'm fine. It's up to you.
Okay.
Do you want to talk a bit about what you were doing there in the first place, or just sort of show pictures and then go into your sort of what you were doing for research?
Okay. So I have this just a couple of slides that I put together. And so I just kind of wanted to start about where I was and what it looks like. So again, if you've seen any of the artwork that we have in our Into the Arctic exhibit right now, you can see some of the similarities. So this is looking at kind of the Canadian side of the Arctic Circle. So up here in NU, this is the Nunavut territory. It's actually a relatively new territory. And part of this is, a lot of the Canadian archipelago that's well above the Arctic Circle or within the Arctic Circle. And so this big island right here is called Baffin Island. And there's a lot of research. So I was at the University of Colorado doing my PhD, and there was a huge number of scientists that would go up here. They do a lot of their climate research on a bunch of stations in Baffin Island. And so this is where we flew into. And then we spent most of our time on this smaller island right across Baffin Bay called Bylot Island. So if we look at this, this is a satellite view. So Pond Inlet, again, this is on the tip of one of the tips of Baffin Island. This is where we flew into, and then we would take helicopters across the inlet and did most of our prospecting kind of down here. So Bylot Island, it's not extremely big. You're talking about a couple of kilometers, or maybe what's my mileage? Maybe like 100 kilometers across. So really not a big island. There were other researchers on this island at the time because there are a lot of snow goose colonies. This is where they go north to breed. So there are a lot of researchers observing the snow geese through the end of the migration and their breeding season. But other than the researchers who come onto this island, this is an uninhabited island. There are no year-round towns or anything like that. When you have the sea ice between Pond Inlet and Bylot Island, people will take snowmobiles across the inlet, and whether they're seal hunting or things like that, they'll do that. So I'm going to skip that real quick. Oops, that is not a great picture. So this is out of focus, and I apologize for that. But this is actually from Baffin Island, looking at the mountains of Violet Island. You can see this little orange tag down here in the corner. And again, I'm sorry, it's really out of focus. These are really old photos that I had to find on an old external hard drive. But this was our runway. So we took, I think we took a single otter into Pond Inlet on this short dirt runway. This is where we landed. And then we waited for the rest of our crew to get there. And once we got there, we actually used helicopters to get from Baffin Island over to Violet Island. Again, it's about 20 kilometers across this bay into Violet Island to where we were prospecting for fossils. So this is one of my favorite photos. And you know what? This makes me think that, oh no, this is the right. Okay. So this is one of my favorite photos. So this is actually looking at one of the ridges to our camp. So this was the first camp. We actually had 2 different camps, but we spent most of our time in this camp. So these yellow over here, these are our tents where we slept. This white and blue over here, those are actually our cook tent and our food tent. So we're in polar bear country. We actually had guns with us at all times. We always had, extra food and water and sleeping bags with us as well. And so when you set up your camp, you have all your sleep tents and you want to make sure you don't have any food or anything in those. And then we put up a bear fence around those. And that's really interesting because, when I'm thinking about a bear fence, I'm like, okay, something to keep polar bears out. Awesome. That makes me feel better. So it's really not at all. It's just a wire that runs around your camp that's connected to a battery. And all it does is if that wire is, so if the connection is broken, so something hits the wire, an alarm goes off. It doesn't keep the bear out. It just wakes you up if there's a bear in the middle of your camp. And so we set up our tents kind of radially with an empty in the middle, and there's plenty of room between all of our tents, with the idea that if a bear breaks that wire and the alarm goes off, it's going to get spooked and it can just run right through and hopefully not over a tent and get out. So if you have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, it's not dark, so that helps. But you have to be careful that you either get low enough to go under the fence or you hit a low spot over the fence, because you definitely don't want to accidentally trigger the fence at 2 o'clock in the morning on a bathroom break or something like that. And then, like a quarter of a mile away or whatever, we had our food and our cooking gear on the other side of camp, again, to keep any sort of bears away from where we're sleeping and not fully conscious. And, there were a couple of guns. I think in this camp, we had 3 shotguns in camp. So they were kind of dispersed with different people around the tent, our little tent city. And so, it's fun and unique experience. We were working out of a kind of with I forgot to look up the name, I can't remember anymore, kind of the National Science Foundation Canadian equivalent, and their Arctic expedition organizers. And so they had what we called the radio show. And so all of, whether they were research, because there are a ton of researchers in the area. There's an island. I'm going to actually go back here. So there's an island up here, and this is Devon Island. And there's a lot of scientific research that goes on there, but that's also where NASA does all of their Mars rover and kind of Mars exploration training, just because the terrain is so unique. And so, there's a team of NASA scientists and just all in this region. There are scientists, there are tour guides, there are different camps that are set up throughout the season. And so every morning at 7 a.m. and every night at 7 p.m. we had what we call the radio show, where it's just kind of command central for this Canadian Science Center, which is call out to all of the different camps to check in, make sure they answered, ask if there are any bear sightings, if they were having any issues, what the weather was, if they were expecting any visitors or packages and stuff like that. So you did that twice a day. And actually, if you missed 2 call-ins in a row, they would automatically send a rescue team out to you. So a little bit of reassuring that you're not going to be too long without a rescue party if needed, but also really important to make sure that you're in camp for those call-in shows. So when we got there, you can see a little bit. You can see it a little bit in this picture. And then when we got there, Baffin Bay was all sea ice. So we got there in late June. We got into our island maybe like the 2nd or 3rd of July. We're on Baffin for a couple of days waiting for the rest of the crew to come in. And so we were out there again, we were looking for fossils, and, you know, we did a little bit of play too. So you can see all of Baffin Bay kind of in the inlet iced in. So this is some of the sea ice that was pushed up on shore. You had to be careful when you went down to the beach. That's where the polar bears would hang out. So we saw some paw prints and stuff like that. We didn't see any bears at that time. But it's cool if you're not really sure how sea ice works. When seawater freezes, just the fresh water freezes. So we're eating chunks of the sea ice because it's fresh water and it's relatively clean. None of us got sick that we know of. So a pretty cool experience. I definitely never, growing up going to the beach in Florida, I definitely never eaten sea ice before. So one of the things you'll see, go ahead.
That really kind of puts it into perspective, because, you know, when you think Arctic, I always think, like snowy plains or, you know, sheets of ice. You don't think about sort of the mountains and the ruggedness of the terrain itself.
Right. Yeah, it is really interesting because, you know, you'll see beautiful blue skies like in all of the photos. I think we had maybe like 2 or 3 cloudy days. So we had phenomenal weather. We had no snowstorms, no wind. You're layered. So you have on long underwear and you have on snow pants and boots and, you know, wool or quick dry socks, and you have on multiple layers, and then you have a snow coat and hat and gloves. And there was one day that like we were just shedding and people had like pants rolled up and we're taking off our long underwear. It probably got to like 55 or 60 and we were like dying in all of this gear that we're wearing, thinking that like, hey, we're in the Arctic, it's going to be cold. A couple of members of this crew had been up in years previous and had really horrible weather with them. But it's just really interesting that whenever you're up there, you have to be so careful because you're so remote, and access, since you're doing so much access, or all of your access essentially, with either helicopters and on and off of islands, or if it's a bigger island with a runway, you're using maybe a Twin Otter plane to get. It's all dependent on the weather. You know, there are a lot of helicopter accidents up there that are weather driven. So you have to be really careful. You always have extra food and water and supplies with you in case you're stranded for a couple of extra days. So the team leaders that I was up there with, so one was a researcher at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and another one is a professor at McGill. They had been up a couple of years previous in a situation where weather kept them on the island a few days longer than scheduled. And so they had extra food and learned some important lessons from how important it is to have that extra food, extra water, in case it takes a couple of days for weather to clear. So, you know, all of our food was dehydrated. So we had propane grills to boil water, and we just add bags of prepared, essentially freeze-dried food to make our meals. And then, because you're up there and it's supposed to be cold, you're kind of like laying on the calories. So we'd always put an extra scoop of margarine and like big hunks of cheese. We had these, you know, cheese by the kilos that had been bought to prepare for up there. So kind of a very interesting perspective to things. We'll skip over the bad pictures. So this was our warm day. You can see these were the crew chiefs. So this is again on Violet Island, looking across the bay to Baffin. So you can start to see the sea ice breaking up. And actually, by the time we left at the end of July, the sea ice was pretty much all gone. We did miss the narwhals. The narwhals come in August. So unfortunately, we didn't see them, but we saw lots of seals. One of the crew chiefs thought that one of the days that we were packing up and moving camp, thought she saw a polar bear in the morning, kind of a white shadow moving down the slope, kind of to the beach area where we had definitely seen paw prints down there. So that was a little unnerving when you think about how big polar bears are, and they're one of the only species known to actually intentionally hunt humans. Hence the guns that we had with us for protection, not for hunting. If you do kill a polar bear, even out of protection of yourself, there's still a lot of fines. You have to do field dressings. You have to present things like the hide and the paws and the head to the local tribal elders and things like that up there. So you really don't want to run into a polar bear or have to shoot one for multiple reasons. Again, not great photos, but one of the things we did have up there, so this is a glaciated island. So this is actually, again, not a great photo, but this is the end of the glacier that doesn't reach the ocean anymore due to glacial retreat. And so we did get a little bit closer to some of the things. So this is actually the body of the glacier. This is our group looking out across the bay. But so here's a glacier that we see actually coming down one of the valleys. So, they're kind of unassuming when you see them from far, and then you get up to them and you see how big they actually are. So really thick, they're not white, they're gray. You actually see that in the artwork of the Into the Arctic exhibit. They're gray, they're striated, where you'll just have layers of dust blowing on them and sediment, and then a new layer of snow and compaction into ice. And so you see these layered.
Do the glaciers make noise? Do they groan or,
We didn't spend, we didn't spend enough time actually around them to hear that. If they're calving, so when they're breaking off at the edge into the water, and this is where you're making, where icebergs are born, those can be really big events, and they're loud. And yes, so you can think of glaciers in a lot of ways like a frozen river. And so they're constantly moving. Since we weren't doing glacier research, we weren't spending a lot of time around them, observing them. This was actually the only day that we got close. This was like the edge of our field area, because you can't just walk across a glacier. And so this is me doing something really, really stupid. There's this little ice bridge between solid land and the glacier with this huge glacial river running underneath it from all of the runoff as the glacier was melting in July. So I decided to climb the bridge and stand on it. Don't try this at home, kids. But these are just massive structures, and you can really see the layers, and they're dirty. Glaciers are really cool from a geologic perspective because they're both erosional and depositional in terms of how they behave. They're scraping up rocks, they're carrying rocks and sediment, but then they're also leaving these huge scars behind them that get preserved in the fossil and the moraines and stuff that get preserved in the rock record. So they're really cool and really powerful. And so we kind of this is one of the crew members giving the glacier a snap. Let's see. And then we have these beautiful, so this is runoff that's coming down one of the valleys. And so again, this is also something that kind of looks unassuming. You're like, oh, you can just tread across that. But this is actually a river that kept us from a different site that we wanted to see. So we're thinking like, oh, maybe we could carry our camp from camp 1 to camp 2, or we could just hike out. And we originally thought we could hike out and just hike to the other area. But we got to this unassuming little creek, and it's this raging glacial river that's just going so fast, and it's so cold that we made a very good decision that we were not going to try to ford it. So we actually got a helicopter to take us from the original camp that I showed before over to a new camp. and set up a new camp to look at another side of the island a little bit more. And that was a fun experience. So we did a lot of work with helicopters, and I had worked for years and years and years prior to this in eastern Montana. And Ian and I, we mentioned a little bit, we went to Montana State together. And so Ian was out there some too, and we'd use helicopters a lot to get to our remote areas or to take big loads in and out of sites. So I had quite a bit of helicopter experience going into this 2007 Arctic field season. And so I was always the one in charge of attaching our sling to the helicopter body. And so we had, unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of this because I was always the one standing under the helicopter, but we have these just big nets, these big cargo nets that cinch at the top with an eye hook. And so I would just hold the eye hook in my hand, and then the helicopter would just come right down on top of me. So he would just hover over me and lower himself, and then I would throw the hook into the eye on the belly of the helicopter, and then I would crawl out the front so that he could see me. And then as soon as I was clear, he would test the load and go up and take it. So I would always attach the sling. So that meant that I was the last one at our original camp. So we loaded up everything in sling. I think there were like 3 or 4 trips that we went over. So half of our crew went over with the first load so that they could unload it and send the cargo net back. And then we had the last load. It took all of the crew from me, but me, and then it took the last cargo net. And so I was the last one at our old camp, and I was about 20 kilometers from where our new camp was going to be. And this was the day that we had seen the polar bear. And so it's kind of one of the most surreal experiences that the last helicopter left. So it was just me, and of course they left me with a shotgun. And so I'm sitting on a 20-gallon paint bucket, essentially filled with Cliff Bars and a bucket of water and a tent and a sleeping bag, because you always want to have food and shelter. And the gun was loaded with bear bangers. And so bear bangers are kind of special shells that go out maybe like 150 feet and then explode. And the idea is that, if you see a bear, you shoot it out, it explodes and scares the bear the other way so that you don't actually have to load any of our high brass shells that we had. So you're trying to be like, okay, how far is 150 feet? Because you don't want to shoot too far and scare the bear towards you. And so I'm just sitting there for like 30 minutes by myself on an uninhabited island, like thinking maybe there's a polar bear and I'll have his little shotgun. But nothing happened, no bears, helicopter came back, we're all safe.
I would imagine time slows down a little bit.
Say that again?
Position. I would imagine time slows down a little bit.
Oh, it did. It's like, okay, how long has it been? How long has it been? But I mean, yeah, but there's nothing out there. There's no noise other than wind. So you can actually hear the helicopter pretty far. So, you can hear it coming well before it gets there. And you're like, okay, I think my heart was just racing the entire time. I was just kind of in this elevated state of hyper awareness. And I don't think I will ever forget that feeling.
Well, it's not often that you're in a place that's truly, wild like that. We just don't do that in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, to say that you're kind of in an uninhabited region is one thing. We've done field work in eastern Montana, and you meant like, oh, okay, there's nobody around me for a couple of miles, but you're still seeing cattle. And so you're like, okay, there's some rancher who either we were working on federal land, so who leases this land, and that there's some farm not too far away. But yeah, out here, you're like, okay, I'm 20 kilometers from anybody, like there's literally nobody on this island except for, the 9 of us. And it's pretty crazy.
So I can only imagine.
Yeah, but so we were up there to do science, and so we're looking at the Cretaceous Kangook Formation. So this is actually sediments that are a little bit younger than we have here in Kansas, but are still within the Cretaceous, and so the age of the dinosaurs. And these are marine sediments or near shore sediments And so actually had a lot of the animals that we have here in Kansas, which is really cool to think about. And so I'm actually going to go back because this is a show that got, I think my original, I redid it, didn't save it. So I'm going to go back up to my maps. Okay, so this is what North America looked like about 77, 75 million years ago. So this is actually a little bit older than the rocks that we're looking at. If we go up here, so this is just kind of focused in on the Arctic region. Right here I've circled, this is Violet Island. So this shows it actually above water, so that's why it's green. The rocks that we're looking at were actually marine, so there was some marine at the time period that we're looking at. So now I'm gonna go back to where that slide was supposed to be. Here. So, you see the lots of green. There's these little tiny plants, everything's just a couple of inches above the ground, no trees, no shrubs or anything like that. And then we had these big exposures of rock, and that's why we were really there, because that's gonna be where you would find fossils. And there are a couple of different sediments that we're looking at. So we had these big, thick mudstones, we had these big, thick sandstones, and then we had these kind of interbedded mud and silt and sand. And so these were representing a environment that had kind of a sea level falling. So things were getting shallower, but a near shore delta. So you have some, terrestrial land river coming into a marine setting. So not the same scale, but the same sort of environment as like the Mississippi Delta, just a much smaller version of that. And it's really some of these sandstones and then these interbedded mud, silts, and sands where we found most of our fossils. So this is pretty cool just for perspective. This is our leader. He's about 6 feet tall, so he's not a short guy. And then there's just huge, massive, just wall of shale with some of these clay structures going through them. And we didn't find any fossils in this, but it was pretty cool to see. So here's sandstone. Here's a bunch of boulders sitting on top of it, which really threw us because it looks like a glacial deposit, but the late Cretaceous was a greenhouse environment, and there weren't supposed to be any glaciers in the Arctic at that time. So really interesting of what that could be. Maybe there were glaciers, or maybe it's a lot like this rock. Yeah, we're not really sure what's going on here.
Confusing, yeah.
Yeah.
But I thought glacier.
Yeah. And so we're a little confused by some of the structures, some of the things that we saw up there. Because, it's remote. It's really expensive to get to. And so there's just not a huge body of research. And most of the geology that I found at the time that was done up there, most of it was actually oil, oil and gas, so petroleum related. So not always the type of information that we are interested in as paleontologists, since we're really interested in what's going on the surface of what's exposed, and petroleum geologists are a lot more interested in what's going on the subsurface, since that's where the reservoirs are. But this is kind of a typical outcrop that we would walk. So one of these knife ridges that was a lot of sand and some silts and muds as well. And we would just actually line up. So I think there were 7 of us. I think there were 7 of us at this time. And we would just line up, maybe 10 feet apart or 15 feet apart and just walk across, combing the desert to look for just anything that was falling out. Most of what we found is what we call floats, so just isolated bones and teeth that were falling out of the hill. We couldn't really find where their source was. But everything, you go down a couple of inches and you hit permafrost. So digging things out in the Arctic is really difficult because the ground is frozen once you go down a little bit. So some of the things that we found up there, so because we're in kind of this deltaic, this transition between land and ocean, we found a bunch of different types of organisms that represent different ecosystems. So because a delta is typically underwater, you get your marine organisms. So we found things like sharks and ratfish. So ratfish is another cartilaginous fish, so things like a chimera. Our bony actinopterygian fish, and coelacanths. So actually a lot of the same type of fish, not necessarily the same species, but the same type of fish fossils that we find in our Cretaceous chalks here in Kansas. And then things like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, which again, we also find in our Cretaceous marine sediments here in Kansas. We did find some terrestrial, so some dinosaur bits, usually just teeth. So some tyrannosaurids and hadrosaurs, those are the duck-billed dinosaurs. Common dinosaurian members of late Cretaceous terrestrial environments. So dinosaurs, I mean, Spinosaurus is kind of a new one to come out. And other than maybe Spinosaurus and marine birds, dinosaurs were pretty much terrestrial. So these weren't things that were necessarily swimming out and living in the water. They would have probably died on land, and then their bones and teeth would wash out in rivers into the delta area. So you do get some of that, some terrestrial fauna in nearshore environments. And then some of these marginal that were probably spending some time on land, some time in water. So seabirds, things like Hesperornithiform. And if you tuned in last week, this is one of the things that one of the animals that I've been studying a lot over the past 10 to 15 years. So maybe some turtles and things like that. But I was up here because of these seabirds. So Hesperornithiforms, hopefully, these are some of the bird bits that we found. Not spectacular. Again, the fossils coming out of the Cretaceous are usually pretty coming out of the Arctic are usually pretty chewed up. And again, because we're finding mostly isolated stuff, they weren't particularly gorgeous like some of the stuff.
Traces on that bone that's on the upper left there.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like boreholes or something?
Probably not. Those may be something where you're getting muscle attachments, because they're actually pretty smooth. So, I mean, it could be something, maybe, if they're pathological, it was some sort of attack, but it probably didn't kill the animal, but it's probably a muscle attachment. This is one of the shin bones. This is a tibiotarsal. And so it could be somewhere where there are muscle attachments put in. I didn't study this bone specifically. But they're really smooth margins. So it's not going to be something that happened after the death of the organism. And if it is some sort of trauma while the animal was alive, it didn't kill it because it had enough time to then smooth out those surfaces versus it being ragged and jagged. So not gorgeous, kind of hard if you don't know what these things are to figure it out, but this is what the birds look like in general. So this is a Hesperornis. Again, we have one of these. We have a great mount at the Sternberg Museum. So these are really cool. They're flightless seabirds that are adapted to kick underwater to hunt down prey. You can see some of the characteristics that we have that show us how it lives. So if you think about the sternum, this is the breastbone. Think about like your Thanksgiving turkey or your chicken. This is where the big white breast muscles attach. These are the flight muscles. These birds weren't flying. They don't have big flight muscles, so they don't have that big keel, like the keel of a ship on the sternum to support all of those flight muscles. They have these tiny little slivers of forelimb. They don't even have their lower limb or finger bones. They have a hip that like sticks out 90-degree angle. Their femur does, so they're not standing on their hind legs. They're kind of belly flopping in the sand if they ever came on water. They have this really long hip for big, powerful leg muscle attachment. They have this really long hind limb, and then these large feet because that's how they're getting their propulsion moving through the water. So really cool, highly adapted animals for their lifestyle of swimming and kicking through the oceans. So the reason that I was really interested in there and, going up there for the experience of it, but also for the science of it, is so we're down here in Kansas. So this is looking at kind of known occurrences of where these Hesperornis seabirds are found. So down here in Kansas, we have a lot of them in western Kansas and our Smoky Hill Chalk. But then there are a lot from the Arctic region as well. And so one of the things that I was really interested in was comparing the birds that live down here in Kansas from our Niobrara Formation, which hosts the Smoky Hill Chalk, as well as those that are found up in the Kanguk Formation. Some of the ones I studied were on Devon Island, and then also ones we found on Violet Island. Because I'm really interested, one of the things I was trying to get at my dissertation is we have these birds in the same genus and sometimes even put in the same species that are, thousands of kilometers apart. We find them in Kansas. We actually find them down into Arkansas. And then we find them up all the way to the North Slope of Alaska and Ellesmere Island at the top of the Arctic. And the question that I always had is this just, the animals with a really broad distribution. So, you have the same species of animals that live all along this area and live in these different habitats, or are they migrating? Kind of like the snow geese do today, where they'll migrate and breed in the north and then spend the winters in the south. So even though it wasn't as cold in the Arctic as it is today, they still had to deal with 24 hours of darkness. And so if you think about the sun not coming out for a couple of months, that's really going to shut down your ecosystems and your food web. So if you don't have your plants or your algae photosynthesizing, then that's the loss of the food source for everything else in the food chain. So even if it's not temperature keeping you out, it could be a lack of food resources keeping you out. So I was trying to set up this comparison to see, differences in these birds that could get to differences in ecosystems. And then maybe if we could find any evidence for migration versus just a really broad distribution. So I think that's most of what I had to do, and I'll stop my share. But so what I saw, and then what we're doing up there for science.
Yeah, so that's a huge question. Is an ancient extinct group of animals migrating? Are they moving around, or are they just widely distributed?
Yeah, so I mean, especially a lot of dinosaur paleontologists are trying to figure out this question of migration, because we really don't have a good answer for how to study it in the fossil record. So I was using a technique called histology. I talked a little bit about this at the end of our chat last week, where I take bones and I cut them up and I put them under a microscope and look at the micro patterns that can tell me about how that animal grew. So a lot of people who will study the non-avian dinosaurs, so the dinosaurs that aren't birds, will cut open the bones and try to interpret the pattern as either, this pattern is evidence of a lot of energy spent during a long distance migration. So if you're going to migrate, 2,000 kilometers, that's going to take a lot of energy. And so that would leave a mark in the bone. And then other people will look at, the same patterns in the bones and say, no, this pattern is evidence that these animals were overwintering in harsh environments. And so maybe there was a time of starvation or something like that. And so kind of this back and forth with nobody actually ground truthing it. And I talked a lot about this last week as well, is the importance we have in ground truthing our knowledge and animals and ecosystems that we can observe today. And so I was looking at Hesperornis and comparing a Kansas to an Arctic specimen. And, I kind of reached this point, I call it my double rainbow, where I was like, what does this mean? And so this is why I started studying penguins. And so I moved on to where I kind of threw in a study of a group of penguins called pygoscillid penguins. So it's the genus Pygoscillus that has the Adelie penguin, the Gentoo penguin, and the chinstrap penguin. Two of those species migrate, one doesn't. And so I was looking to see, okay, we have these three species, they live together. They were all from the Antarctic Peninsula. And so if I know that two are migrating and one isn't, are there any differences I can see in the bone that could lead to evidence for migration that we could then apply to the fossil record. And, you know, what I actually found there is that I did not find evidence for migration in the bones, but what I did find evidence was for extremely rapid growth in the chicks of the species that did not migrate. So if you think about migration, why are you migrating?
Following your food?
Yeah, you're following your food. You know, if you're living somewhere where a really harsh environment and your ecosystem is going to shut down because, you know, you have 24 hours of darkness and you don't have your algae blooms and your plants, then you're going to follow your food source. And so if you don't have a whole lot of food because you're staying put in a harsh environment over winter, what do you have to be able to do?
Either hibernate or put on a lot of weight.
Yeah, you have to be able to not starve to death. And so we actually see this in king penguins as well. So king penguins are very large. They're the second largest species other than after emperor penguins. And where emperor penguins actually breed during the winter. That's why you see all the video footage of the king penguins just being absolutely insane on the Antarctic shelf and these blizzards, is because they're breeding and they're hatching their young during winter. And that sounds really stupid, but the reason for that is because they're the biggest penguins. And so they need a full year to grow before the next winter, where they're going to have to go through a period of starvation because it's winter. And so to hatch during the winter and then essentially steal the resources from their parents, because that's what kids do, you know, they would then be able to be big enough to survive the next winter. So king penguins, the second biggest species, they still hatch during the spring. And so what they do, they have a shorter growing season. And so they gain weight really, really fast because they have to be big enough to then survive starvation the next winter. And they don't actually complete their growth until the second year. So in my Gen 2 penguins, which was my non-migratory species, I see much, much faster growth of the chicks. And I think that's because they're staying in place and they're not migrating. And so they have to get really, really big to deal with possible starvation during the winter. Because, you know, if you don't die, you don't breed. And if you don't breed, you can't evolve. And so, you know, it's pretty important to stay alive. Or it's pretty important to eat.
Yeah, I like eating.
Yeah.
All right.
So.
Well, I think we've been going quite a while now. Is there anything else you want to sort of get out there and let everybody, you know that about any cool insights to either research or experience out there?
I mean, so much of it, and I think, Ian, when we were talking earlier this week about our experience, and, you know, on some reason you have to be conscious because you don't want to get, I mean, there's so much privilege that goes along with it. But, you know, whether it's, you know, in a different country or just different places in your own country, and just different regions in your own state, just how important travel is to get a broader view. So again, you know, you don't have to go all the way up to the Arctic to experience this, but just seeing, you know, the way other people live and other types of culture, even if they're just subsets of our own culture, is just so important to understanding, you know, the world as a whole and that global view. And this trip was, you know, 2007, and I had traveled, you know, as a kid, but it's a very different experience than when you travel as an adult. And this was one of the first trips that I took to a pretty significantly different culture, even if we weren't interacting with it all day, every day, you know, and it's just so interesting to talk to people from a different background and to just gain a better sense of their perspective. And I just think that helps make us all better and more empathetic people to understand and really observe the differences between different cultures and different subsets of the population. So that was kind of my worldview of it, and you know,
it's a big, vast world out there, and you know, sometimes forget in our, daily lives, getting up, going to work, taking care of the kid, that,
Yeah.
There is a very, very vast and very, very diverse world out there. And, that's, physically, geographically, as well as culturally, and,
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit hard to get out there right now, but
Yeah, it is. And, I know a lot of people are struggling with that, whether it's just, struggling to leave their town, or if they're from more of a globe-trotting sect, then yeah, it's really hard. And especially for how, I mean, it's so oversaid and cliche, but how global we are, how globalized, how much globalization has gone in the last 10 to 20 years alone, largely, internet, but also economically related and politically related, that it's really difficult. I think we're just so much more kind of like microscopic at our own little own little worlds right now than we have been for a while. That it's kind of this, we have this global perspective, but I feel like we've been really narrow lately within that.
Yeah. Not necessarily by choice, but maybe
no, definitely not.
Maybe it's there's a positive in that. And I haven't worked as much in my backyard as I have this last couple of months, so
I had to cut myself off buying flowers.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for spending time talking about your experiences and sharing these really incredible images with us, and the scope of your research. It's a pretty amazing thing to see happen. So we all appreciate it, and we're fascinated, and hopefully we'll hear more about some more recent stuff that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, but in the meantime, I mean, if you're in the area or region and you haven't been in yet, definitely come check out the Into the Arctic exhibit. Kind of the vastness and the colors are really so realistic in what you see in this artwork. It gives you a pretty good grasp of what some of the spectacular landscapes look like up there. And you can kind of take a first glance and they seem a little just blues and grays, and then you look at the detail that have been put into them, and you can see the color and you can see the life, and it's just really cool. And
some of these paintings
are very lifelike,
very large, and I guess I would call photorealistic. So I mean, you can stand there and get a sense of scale with some of the really large ones that are in our lobby. It's almost like looking through a window. So definitely come and check it out.
Great.
All right. Well,
and wear masks. So we're all I will throw this in. So the Sternberg Museum are always evolving COVID policy. We are asking that everybody 5 and over wear masks. I think I saw that as a release yesterday. So be prepared for that when you come in. But if you're smart and safe, you can still enjoy the museum and all that we have to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you. And everybody like and share our live feeds.
Yep. And if you have questions, put them in the comments and I'll come by and answer them.
Absolutely. There's a question right now. Did any of the field team collect any samples of the boulders at the top slope of the island?
We did not collect any boulder samples. They were huge and we had weight limits on our helicopter. So we had to be pretty conscientious of how much we collected. I did collect sediment samples from some of our sites in case they had any like microorganisms and stuff like that. And that's actually a pretty funny story because so when you fly in and out of Pond Inlet, it's a dirt runway and it's a one-room airport. That we actually spent the night in our last day. They just left us in there and didn't have a problem with that. All the workers left and we were just camping out the room. When I got my boarding pass, it was handwritten. And so, there's no computer check-in or anything like that. So it's pretty crazy. And I actually ended up breaking my leg when I was up there. So I was in an ATV accident, and the driver ran off the road, and I got caught between the ATV and a boulder. So I was on crutches, and they didn't have a doctor, and their x-ray machine was broken. So I was trying to convince myself I just had a sprained ankle. So part of the reason why they let us camp out at the airport, since we weren't able to like hike the mile from our camp into the airport in the morning. And so I just like shoved sediment samples into my check bag, but then also my backpack, my carry-on. And I don't know, like I went through customs in Ottawa, and maybe it's because I was like the poor girl crying on crutches, but nobody stopped me. So I had some sediment samples that I brought back, but no, we didn't get any from the boulders. We weren't really up there doing a whole lot of the geology work. And so we weren't really prepared to spend the time or have the necessary equipment to do the sampling needed to really figure out those questions. When you go somewhere like that, because it is so remote and it's so expensive to get there, you're doing it on grant money. And so to get the grant money, you're writing a specific project, and the project that was funding the students, and then the professors and curators, and then me, were very paleontology specific. And so, that was why we're there. And then, you need to stay pretty mission centric when you're using grant money and you don't have a lot of time to make sure you can actually do what you say you're going to do when you apply for the grant.
Cool. Well, yeah. Hopefully that sort of answered the question.
Yep.
All right. I guess that'll do it for us. Okay. Have a great 4th of July, Independence Day. Stay safe. Don't set anything on fire. Use common sense. Pet your dogs. Tell them it's okay.
And cats. Mine's terrified.
And cats. All right. Well, we'll see you later then.
Okay. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.